Good morning. Welcome to Sunday School at Cedar Lane United Methodist Church. This week, we are actually back in Jerusalem, but it's 14 years later, according to the NIV chronology. Now, I'm going to try to share my desktop because I want to show you a couple of things. Hopefully, this will all come up. Well, it's not going to let me pull up both of them. All right. Okay. Go away. It's not a water. All right. We looked at this last week a little bit. So we see the capture of Babylon, that's by Cyrus. And that's the first group coming back. And then we get opposition. Finally, the temple ceased, the temple completed in 516. And then we see Ezra show up and from Babylon. And then now we're some 14 years later down here in 444 BC as Nehemiah starts his project. Now, I looked at another item. Let me pull this over so you can maybe see it a little bit. Just this is the dynasties that we're talking about. It's part of those. We don't have to worry about these guys up here. Cyrus that we were talking about is Cyrus the Great. Cyrus II, if you will, from 559 to 530 BC. Now, then it changes, and if you'll see from 530 to 522, this Cambyses, this guy obviously wasn't there. But then in 522, you see Darius take over. And that's when we see things starting to happen. And then you get Xerxes, and there's not much that goes on during this time. But then you get to Artaxerxes. And if you'll notice, this encompasses both the dates for Ezra and for Nehemiah. Stop sharing for a minute. Now, one thing that helps me to remember things is to figure out the purpose for each group returning to Jerusalem. For instance, the first group of returning exiles under Sheshbazzar in 537 BC were authorized to rebuild the temple. Now they built the altar and started the temple, but they ran into resistance, and so we had that stoppage for 10 years, and then they finally completed the temple in 516 BC. Now Ezra comes back in 458, which is of course quite a span of time, but as we studied last week, he came back to restore proper life to the community of God, to God's people. As we remember, he was a priest and well-versed in the law. So the synopsis for Nehemiah coming back in 444 BC is to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So you've got the temple, and now you're getting the walls rebuilt. So the story is moving toward a restored city of Jerusalem. So what do we know about Nehemiah? He was an exile working in the citadel of Susa, where Esther had been queen during the reign of Artaxerxes' father, Xerxes the First. So remember, the father right before that, that was where Esther was. So I went, oh, that made it interesting. Now, Nehemiah was the person who served wine to the king. Um, he was the royal wine taster, if you will, which means he put his life on the line every single day. But if you're the one who is constantly concerned about someone poisoning you, then who you trust to serve you the wine is extremely important. And Nehemiah had that trust. We know from the scripture that he had at least two brothers. One of them, Hananiah, and his name may be possibly Hananiah, and the other is just a shortened version, came to Susa from Judah. When Nehemiah asked him about the news of the Jewish remnant and about Jerusalem, Hananiah gave him some sad news. They are in great trouble. They live in disgrace because the city walls have been destroyed and the gates burned with fire. Now, Nehemiah's reaction actually shows us his heart. He sat down and cried. Instead of getting angry and ranting and raving, he mourned. Then he fasted and he prayed. He loved both God and Israel and consequently the city of Jerusalem. And in his prayer, he confessed the sin of his family and all of Israel. And he reminded God of his promises to bring Israel back from wherever they had been scattered, back to the promised land, if they repented of their sin. He also reminded God of his covenant of love toward Israel. Made me ask, do we remind ourselves and God of his great and precious promises when we pray? Or are we afraid that we might offend him by doing so? Now, Nehemiah doesn't go running to the king. He actually prays about this situation for 4 months. He can't leave his post without the king's permission. So he can't go back and do anything. But what resources would he have even if he did go back? And on whose authority could he act or would he act? I mean, if he's going back as an individual, he doesn't, he's just an individual. The people in charge are going to ask a lot of other questions. So Nehemiah actually took his life in his hands because he was sad one day in the king's presence. Now, in those days, your personal problems didn't matter to the king. You were expected to be glad and upbeat before the king. But Artaxerxes noticed that Nehemiah's countenance and asked him why he was sad when he obviously wasn't sick. Now, Nehemiah told him why. And the king's question was, what do you want? Wow. So Nehemiah prayed a quick prayer to the God of heaven and then answered the king. In those 4 months of prayer, he had devised a plan, one that gave him permission, authority, and the needed resources. Now, for me, it's easy to get lost in the details. In the end, I have to back out and take a look at the big picture. One of those rabbit trails I took included trying to find a map of Jerusalem in Nehemiah's day with the various gates. So what I want to do is pull a map back up. And while we read, I want you to be able to look at that map and follow along. Hopefully you can see my cursor when I share this. Let me go to this. And I'm going to full screen this. Because I'm going to change it. Can you all begin to see that? Or do I need to blow it up much more? All right. So Lewis has agreed to read for us. And I'm going to have him read Nehemiah 2, verses 11 through 16. And he starts down here at the valley gate. Now, let me point out one thing. You see these darker colored walls on this? These are the walls that Nehemiah would build. This is more the current old city of Jerusalem. So we're talking about a different set of walls in some respect. So Lewis, would you mind reading for us?
Sure. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night, I went out through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work.
So when Nehemiah arrives at Jerusalem, first thing he does is go to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates and give them the letters from King Artaxerxes, giving him permission to rebuild the walls, and another one that authorized the keeper of the king's forest to provide wood for Nehemiah. Now, there were some guys that weren't real happy about this, and that's Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official. They really did not want anybody looking after Israel's welfare. Now, in contrast to Nehemiah, to Ezra, Nehemiah did not arrive alone. Artaxerxes had sent army officers and cavalry, horseback, with him. That in itself would have sent a signal to anyone who wanted to oppose Nehemiah. Not that it stopped them, but it's kind of impressive when you arrive with the king's army officers. Now, notice that he rested for 3 days before doing anything. Now, scripture doesn't tell us what he did during those 3 days, but we can kind of imagine. They all needed rest. They had been on the road for about 4 months, traveling 6 days a week. They would not have traveled on the Sabbath because Nehemiah was a good practicing Jew. He and all of those with him had to have a place to stay. So they would have been finding billeting for everybody. And I imagine that he wandered around Jerusalem a little bit to get a look at the city. He'd probably never been there. And I'm sure people came to introduce themselves. However, he never revealed his purpose in coming to Jerusalem or his plans to anyone. My mind keeps wanting to think of modern Jerusalem. Now, this is the old city. Modern Jerusalem is all over the place now. It's a city that's full of markets and shops and modern businesses and crowding, and there's like 850,000 people in this city now. But what I could find in those days, this Jerusalem housed between 1,000 and 3,000 people. So within these walls. And of course, the city had been destroyed. That means they had the walls, the houses, everything had been destroyed. And these people had come in and rebuilt what they could. So it's much smaller. Now, he deliberately inspected those walls when it was dark. He intentionally only took a few men with him, and only he was on horseback. We all know horses make a lot of noise. So keeping it a few men and only one horse reduced the noise so people didn't get curious. The journey he took him south around this wall and around the curve. And the reason this is a curve here is because this is the end of the mount. And this is the Hinnom Valley coming this way across the bottom, and then the Kidron Valley going up this way. I don't know if you can see my cursor move or not, but it goes up on the right-hand side of the picture. Now, the way he did this is he rode up here, but he did not make a complete circuit of the city. Maybe, who knows, maybe he saw the western side of the wall as he entered the city, or while he was looking around. We don't really know. But this eastern wall, which is the right-hand side of the picture, is actually built on the mount. And there's a hill, pretty steep hill, that goes down into the Kidron Valley, and then the Mount of Olives actually faces this eastern gate, as you see here. So not the easiest place to build, not the easiest place to attack either. So why didn't he tell anybody what he was up to? Why did he do the inspection at night? We'll leave those questions laying out there. Crystal, would you read verses 17 and 18 for us, please?
Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work.
Now, we don't have a timeline. I'm going to stop sharing this for right now. We don't have a timeline as to when Nehemiah talked with the nobles, the priests, the officials, and the Jews. But there wouldn't have been a good reason to wait. Too many people would start asking questions, too many conjectures as to what he was up to. But in this meeting, he stated the obvious to the folks. The walls are down, the gates are burned. Then he surprised more than a few people by saying, let's rebuild. But he gave them hope when he said, God's in this because God has shown me favor by doing thus and such, either providing everything that would be needed, the permission, the wood for the gates. All they had to do was start rebuilding. But notice that he uses that personal pronoun just like Ezra did, we. He doesn't exclude himself, set himself apart in any way. He's part of the group. We're going to do this. We will no longer be in disgrace. Also, all of them probably knew what Jerusalem had been in its glory days. I'm sure they had heard the stories from David's time in Solomon's temple, that it was God's holy city, and it was beautiful. Rebuilding the walls offered hope for rebuilding Jerusalem itself. A city without walls is open to attack at any time. And Nehemiah got the response he was looking for. They were all in. Now, one of the brilliant things about this is that Nehemiah had not given the naysayers any chance to build an argument or support against rebuilding the wall. His inspection at night kept his intentions secret, and it was a great strategy as far as I can see. Priscilla, would you read verses 19 and 20 for us, please?
Okay. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you are doing? They asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it.
God's favor didn't mean that they didn't have opposition. Those three guys didn't like anybody working on Israel's behalf. They weren't necessarily the ones totally in charge, but they were mocking and accusing Nehemiah of rebellion, even though he had already given the authorities the letters that said he could do it. Artaxerxes knew what Nehemiah was doing, so he didn't have to worry about that. Now, in the end, the three of them wound up causing enough trouble that the people had to work with a sword in one hand and a brick in another. So it got a little testy. But Nehemiah's response to them wasn't to get angry. He says, the God of heaven will give us success. We're his servants. We will start building. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. The Arab was there. The Ammonites are the ones that didn't greet Israel when they came into the promised land. They didn't provide them food. They didn't even give them passage through their land, just free passage. So God just said, nope, they're not part of this. So all of that is part of what's going on here. Now, I have another bit to share with you. I got a lot of share today. Let me find what I was looking at. There it is. I'm going to share this, and we're going to change the page. Now, as you look here, I want to show you this. This portion of the wall, and I'm going to change pictures. It's the same picture, but it's got a circle on it. The circled portion of the wall, this is a part of Nehemiah's wall. And there are lots of other pictures of the wall. This is a stepped wall, and this is a portion of it. They found, it's crazy what they found. All of this is pretty hastily built. It's not perfectly straight and all of that kind of stuff. And that was part of the reason that they knew this, but they actually had to disassemble this wall, believe it or not, and then put it back. But they found pottery. They actually got down to the very bottom of it, and they found buried dogs, which was from the Persian era, which was before this was actually built. So that's part of what they used to do it. Now, this web address down here at the bottom is where I found this. So if you want to write it down or want me to send it to you, I'll do that. I used this picture. This is a picture in the paper, or in the article. This lady is standing on top of that wall. So you get an idea of just exactly how big this is. I'm gonna back out. At the very top of the picture, that's her. Take away our circle. So you get an idea of the massive structure that this wall really is. God knew exactly how much Nehemiah loved him and God's people and Jerusalem. God knew Nehemiah wanted to help his people. God gave Nehemiah a plan of how to meet a real need for his people at that time. And we at Cedar Lane have seen the same thing here. Seen that same process play out as we have a food pantry ministry, a kids closet, and Clara's closet ministry, which provide food and clothing to the community. Now, God put a plan in the hearts of his people who live today to meet the needs in our community. God seems to start with one person to whom he gives a vision and then invites others to join them in doing God's work. I don't think I finished what I was supposed to write, but we each have an opportunity, an invitation from God to participate in the work of his ministry among all the people of the world. I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. God bless you. We'll see you next week. Okay. We have a sum total of 5 minutes. Any comments or questions, thoughts, observations?
Hey, Danny, mine shows that it's still recording. Is that right?